Pine-Bush dinner, I'm very happy to welcome Mary Beth Kolozsvary, a professor of environmental studies and sciences from Siena University. Before we start, I have a couple of announcements. You may have noticed that today is Thursday, not Wednesday. And we always have dinners on Wednesdays, but the church has been, is not available on Wednesdays anymore. So it looks like for the foreseeable future, we'll have dinners on Thursdays. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Good. So we're going to do, for the very first time, thanks to Maddie Kennedy, we're going to do live stream. So welcome to all of our live streamers. I'm sure we have many by now. But we're going to try the live streaming. We do, when I get around to it, do post the dinners on the dinners with Save the Pine-Bush on iTunes. But this is a new part. So also, I want to let you know that Save the Pine-Bush has been attending a lot of planning board meetings in Colony and Guilderland. And if you'd like to come with me, or come with us, there's a bunch of us that go, because they're paving over the Pine-Bush at a very rapid rate in this year. There's a proposal to build apartments in Guilderland, and on every table, plus flyers at the door, there are flyers about it. Dan is holding up the flyer, thank you very much, about that proposal. If you're interested in working on trying to prevent that from being built, please see me. And also, we'd like you to sign the petition, please. I'd like to acknowledge that we have an elected official here tonight. So Sam Fine, the newly elected city auditor, is here.
Another one. Another elected official.
No, I think there's just one.
Oh, isn't he elected?
I think used to be. What? Yeah, we had a former elected official, who was on the Albany City Council thing. I want to make an announcement that there is a group, Zero Waste, in Albany, the capital region, that's working on zero waste issues. And Wendy, who I think has disappeared to the kitchen, knows a lot more about it, but it's very important that we be involved in zero waste because it's going to have to do with probably the landfill, the transfer station, which are all in the Pine-Bush. Thank you, Wendy. We have a very late addition to our program this evening, so we're going to have two speakers tonight. One is going to be very brief, and then, of course, we'll have Mary Beth. Thank you. So it's really important for us to notice there's a lot of bad things going on these days in the United States, I would say. But we can't ignore everything. We need to work on some issues that we can work on. And Governor Hochul is in the process of gutting the State Environmental Quality Review Act. Without the State Environmental Quality Review Act, Save the Pine-Bush could not do its work. And we need, and the abbreviation is SEEKR. Without SEEKR, we cannot do our work. So Roger Downs, who is the Conservation Director from the Atlantic chapter of the Sierra Club, is very kind, and he's come tonight, and he's going to briefly explain to us what Governor Hochul is doing to change SEEKR that's going to make our lives absolutely miserable. So thank you so much, Roger. If you could come up, and you have to come up here because I'm an old person, I can't hear anything without the microphone.
Thank you all. So I prepared a long slide presentation, and Lynn rejected it. Said that the print was too small, for one. And secondly, I only had 6 minutes, and I'm already eating into it. But I cannot underestimate. I mean, in my 25 years of activism with the Sierra Club, I've never seen the environment more at threat, New York's environment, than under Governor Hochul. And we are, I could go on about the climate law that she is gutting, and I think that that is where the environmental community is focused. CLCPA passed in 2019 that will help lead New York and the world out of the climate crisis. We're the 10th largest economy in the world. She is gutting the core of that. We sued her last year because she refused to go forward with the mandated regulations. Instead of complying with the judge's order, she is holding the legislature hostage. So before I talk about seeker, I just want you to understand the process. Not too long ago, but I actually don't know when, I think 7 or 8 years ago, the legislature hadn't seen a pay increase in about 10 years, so they voted during the budget back then for a package so that they get pay increases, but they agreed to terms that if there was a budget that was late past April 1st, they would not receive a paycheck until there was a budget completed. And everyone warned back then, this is going to be used against you. And Governor Hochul is using it like a cudgel because she knows that at least half the legislature on a salary, especially in New York City, of $150,000 a year, cannot last more than a month. Tomorrow it will be a month, and they haven't been paid, and they are caving. And so the climate law is getting gutted in really horrible ways, and it is setting us back a decade on climate progress. But Seeker is in its 51st year this year, and Save the Pine Bush, you've done incredible amounts to shape that law, to give it teeth. And you know, every time the Sierra Club sues, half our memorandum of law is Save the Pine Bush cases. So this is the proposal that she is moving forward with. She's frustrated that there's not enough affordable housing or housing in general in the state. This is something we're all concerned about. We all want people to live just lives and to have affordable housing. But the way she is doing it is essentially blaming the environmental review. It's not that we've got to the point where we're looking at housing as a commodity, that it is not a right, that it is something that is speculated upon, that there are Airbnb constructs, that it is taken off the market for everyday people, and then we have foreign investments in the city that are taking half our real estate. That isn't the issue. The issue is the environmental review. And so she has set up a construct where housing developments are exempt from seeker up to 100 units. Right now, as you know, with seeker, there's a type 2 list. And we, I think, exempt up to 3 units in the subdivision. That's on the type 2 list. It never requires an EIS. And, you know, we have been losing a lot of valuable habitat and open space by 1,000 paper cuts because of these little things. But if a housing unit now that comes in with 100 units, and it could be 100 houses, or it could be 100 parking apartments, it will be exempt from review. Now, she says, well, look, I'm only focusing on disturbed areas, but if you look at the language in the budget right now that is not being negotiated, she sits across the table from the Senate and Assembly who are losing their minds over this. They understand what it means. And she's saying, no deal, you're not going to get paid until you agree to this. There's no negotiation on this. And basically the definition of disturbed land is you can drive a truck through. If it's a lawn, it's disturbed land. You know, they describe it as former agricultural land, not active, but I think, you know, if it hasn't been active in agriculture 2 of the past 5 years, it's disturbed land. There is a requirement that it has to be near existing sewer and water, but when you're looking at the pine bush, I think that that's almost anywhere. One could say that there is a sewer or water system nearby, and that we have plenty of places in rural areas where the IDAs have done speculative development of sewer and water lines to nowhere. It's these sort of development fishing areas. And now these things are going to be exempt from seeker. I mean, just looking at the flyer that you have there of this 2-unit proposal, there are there are 105 units each or something like that. If the governor's proposal goes forward, which will take impact immediately, so this could happen in a week, that basically all they have to do is cut 5 units off of one, you know, maybe conveniently say we're going to take the other one off the table for now, and it would be exempt. It would be under type 2, no environmental review. They wouldn't have to consider the endangered species. I know the Senate and Assembly are pushing back, at least with a checklist of things to look at, that engineers have to look at water and sewer to make sure there's capacity. There has to be biologists, looking for endangered species. It can't be in floodplains or wetlands. It can't destroy historic resources. The governor has none of those considerations in her proposal, and she's trying to ram them through. So anyway, I know I promised only 5 minutes, so that's it. Lynn very, very kindly put together a little sheet. There's a QR code in there. I mean, I'm kind of a Luddite, but I guess if you hold your camera, you know how to do that. Lynn trains people well. You can take action. It is an action alert that goes to the governor, to Majority Leader Stuart Cousins, and to Carl Hastie in the Assembly, begging them not to do this in secret, not to gut the climate law. And stay tuned, because she's about to gut our wetland regs and make them worse than they ever have been. We just passed the most progressive wetland law in the country, and because of a very frivolous lawsuit that had, an undesirable outcome, she's not going to appeal it, and she's going to plunge our wetlands protections into this purgatory we cannot get out of unless we change governors. I don't know what to do because, Blakeman is fully MAGA, but I just at least want to put out the call that everyone should be calling Governor Hochul and protesting this assault on the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. I wish we had better news. So please take a flyer. We have lots of flyers. I think it's still on the table outside. And you can use the QR code or just call up the governor's office and tell her that we don't want her to gut seeker, because seeker's been around for a long time and it's been very helpful for our environment. So thank you, Roger, and I'm sorry for sad news at Save Congress. But now, and I'm also, one thing I forgot to do in my introduction is to welcome all the new people who are here tonight, and I hope you really enjoyed the wonderful, delicious lasagna and the camaraderie. Now I would like to introduce Mary Beth Kolozsvary, a professor from Environmental Studies and Sciences from Siena University, and she's going to talk about her work in phenology, which is the scientific study of periodic biological phenomena, such as flowering, breeding, and migration, in relation to climate change and its implications. So I think her talk is going to be wonderful. And let me see if I can make the projector.
I'm sure it's going to be uplifting as well, right?
It was working. Yeah, there it comes. You can start. I'll just say,
Okay. And you just advance. I don't do max, so let's go arrow.
let me see. The arrows are right here.
Okay. We'll try to manage. I probably won't be able to go back if that's the case. I'm also a mouse person too, so this is it's all right. But I do know QR codes. So thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak. I'm excited to talk a little bit about climate change and some of the work that I'm doing studying periodic biological phenomena. And I'll get into explaining what phenology is a little bit later. So I'm going to first just make sure, kind of go through so that everybody's thinking the same way in terms of global climate change, the cause, what we're seeing and observing, how it's affecting individual species, but also I'm going to try to prime everybody's mind for thinking about how scientists study ecosystems. So when it starts getting complicated, how we approach that, how we do that, and what we're seeing. And it's interesting, we talked about the wetlands law in New York State. Vernal pools are a unique type of wetland that had just been basically now covered by the new wetlands law and wetlands regulations, and now that is under threat. So I'm going to talk a little bit how cool they are too, as well as part of my study. And then we'll go. So greenhouse, the greenhouse effect. So the Earth's atmosphere is filled with gases. It envelops the Earth's surface. The sun's energy comes through that atmosphere, hits the Earth's surface, and then radiates back out. And there we have this, again, this envelope of gases, CO2, methane, other trace gases in the atmosphere. And then and these gases will absorb some of that energy and then re-radiate it out. And some of it eventually makes it back out. Some of it gets re-radiated back to the Earth's surface. And that's actually a good thing, because if we didn't have this envelope of gases surrounding the Earth's surface, the temperature would be much colder, and we wouldn't be able to support biological life on Earth. But what the problem is that as a result of human actions over time, we have increased the amount of gases into the atmosphere, and so it's acting like this little greenhouse, and it's doing its greenhouse job, and so now the temperature's increasing over time. And it's directly as a result of humans and human actions that are releasing and adding more gases into the atmosphere. This is a graph that shows, is there a pointer? It's okay if there's not, but if there is, it would help. Just because of the microscope, or microphone. Right, because I like to explain the graphs. I'm an instructor. So that 0 line is the average annual temperature from 1901 to, I think, like 2000 or something. So that's kind of like our baseline average. And on the y-axis, any of those bars that are below that line, and it goes from like 1880 to 2010 or something like that. Any of the bars that fall below the line means that in those years, the average annual temperature was less than that average from 1901 to 2000. And any of the bars that are above, the ones in red, are years where the average annual temperature was greater than that. And so as you see this is compelling data. It really shows you from, I think, in the mid-1970s is the last time that the average annual temperature was below that average. And so you can see how over time there's been this general trend of warming over time. This is what we call global warming. When you start talking about global climate change, we're talking about what happens as a result of this global warming over time. So this graph shows temperature change over the past 50 years. And if you see the darker red, you can see up to near the Arctic Circle, etc. That is the largest. Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so you press this, and it's this little rubber thing.
Okay, all right, thank you. Awesome.
Can everybody hear in the back?
Oh, yes. Sure. Okay, great. Okay, yes, the dark red, again, greatest amount of changes. There's actually some places in the southern hemisphere where it's been actually decreased a little. But as you can see, that the temperature change over time has been unevenly distributed across the Earth's surface. It's not uniform. As a result of these increased temperatures, there's been increased cases of heat waves. It also affects things like general weather patterns. So we're seeing, again, increasing temperatures overall. Some areas are getting higher amounts of precipitation. Others are getting less amounts of precipitation. So it's really disrupting the climate overall. And I'll just give an example, again, thinking about ecological communities, coral reefs. So coral reefs are these really unique, very biodiverse, rich systems that are in the oceans, near shores and shallow waters, tropical, subtropical climates. They're composed of coral with algae, zooxanthellae, that live in the tissues. It's what we call a symbiotic relationship. So the algae is getting a place to stay, so a place to live, and the algae is photosynthesizing, and the coral's getting energy as a result of it. So it's in this really close, tight-fitting relationship, and that's why you get these brilliant colors at these coral reefs. They're very important, again, for biodiversity. They only cover like 1% of the ocean's of the ocean's surface ocean, but I think they harbor about 25% of marine species. So really rich, very important in terms of nurseries, larval fish, other organisms hang out there, live there. Also predators, so they escape predators, but then the predators go there and they hang out there because it's good hunting as well. And they're also really important too for protecting shorelines. So think about wave actions, and these coral reefs can be great to attenuate the waves, and so helps protect the shoreline communities as well. And as a result, they're very sensitive, that symbiotic relationship, very sensitive with slight increases in temperature. In many instances, in most cases, the zooxanthellae, the algae will get expelled from the coral. And so that's what we've heard, if you've heard of coral bleaching. So that, again, in some cases they can rebound. There's some genetic studies that are showing in some areas they're adapting a little bit to the changing temperatures, but overall, this is what you're seeing as a result of it. And so it's very alarming. So think about that in terms of the effects on species, as well as ecological communities, very ecological communities. And those areas are really important for economics, right? So a lot of people fish there, tourism, lots of things like that. Communities are relying on that. Another basic result of the global warming and the global climate change are melting of glaciers and polar ice. So we've got our whole water cycle, our water budget and reservoirs of water, and these big, large glaciers and these areas that have held water for long periods of time are beginning to melt. Remember that really dramatic increases towards that, like the Arctic Circle, etc. So you got melting of that, melting of the polar ice, and then consequent, you get, where's the water going to go? It's going to go into the ocean. And so you see sea level rise as a result of that. And then you have probably seen the iconic photos of species that rely on these ice packs, like seals, polar bears, and you see that they're reducing the area that they have. They have to hunt, to rest, and they're having to swim great distances to get from one ice pack to another ice pack. So that's your iconic charismatic megavertebrate effects. So that's one of those effects. But then also that sea level rise. Think if you've ever spent time along the coast where you've got those really coastal marshes, Massachusetts, all along the East Coast, Long Island, etc., where you've got these important salt marsh communities that are on the borders, and then they're very sensitive in terms of they've got this zonation that's very distinct. Which type of species can really survive in the deeper water that's only inundated most of the time, but only periodically exposed, and then ones that are higher up on the shores as well, that are just, so you got receding. So this graph shows here supposedly an example of what's happening as a result of the sea level rise. The ecological community is potentially moving up slope towards the land. But as we all know, along these coastal areas, you've got a lot of development. You don't always have these opportunities for that. So that's another effect of global climate change. This is not the most attractive map, but it showed what I wanted to show the best. So another potential result of global climate change is shifts in species ranges. So many species are very adapted to particular temperatures. So just like humans or other species, there are temperatures where we are ideal in terms of our biological functions and surviving, and we might be able to tolerate a range of temperatures, but if it gets too cold or too hot, we're losing that ability to survive. We got reduced growth, reduced ability to survive, more susceptible to diseases, etc. And so different species are like that as well. Temperature is one of the many factors that climate is affecting that can affect species and where they're able to survive. So biologically. So in general, and there's been numerous studies that have shown that species ranges are moving away from the equator towards the poles, as well as moving up in elevation. So if you spent time in the Adirondacks or in the mountainous environment, and you took a hike up a hill, you can imagine as you're at the base of the mountain, it's a little cooler, and then as you walk up, you get different zones of vegetation and different temperatures as a result of that as well. Same kind of thing, up and moving northward or moving upward to generally track those types of conditions that the species are generally best at. And I picked this one because this shows from 1960 to 1990, the distribution map, and right around here in New York State, we are dominated by the Maple Beach birch community. I know the Albany and Pine Bush is a little bit of an anomaly in that, but in general, if you're looking at it at the broad scale, that's the forest community that dominates this area. But then as temperatures changing as a result of the global climate change, we'll see a shift in species composition to oak hickory. So that's what's projected. I love oaks. I love oaks. They're awesome. But I really love snow, and I really love our community here. So this is a really good way to see how the communities are projected to be changing over time. This shows a mountain. This is another study that shows is showing how different species they're not all going to respond the same, and that's what it makes. That's why when you start thinking about the effects of global climate change on ecological communities, it gets complicated fast. So on the left side here is the current distribution on a mountain, and you've got some species, such as the one on the left, is more at the lower elevations. You've got the species right here near the middle that is very abundant from the base of the mountain all the way to the top, and some species that are very restricted to just one part of the mountain. And then the range shifts in response to climate change can differ very greatly. So I'll just look at the one to the right of that middle bar. That's the species that was, species A, I guess, was abundant throughout or present at all elevations. And one example would be that the temperatures, conditions down at the lower elevations are unsuitable, and so now they're just occupying the middle to the upper layers. That's one potential response. You can see here in species B, I think that's it right there. No, there it is. Couldn't remember which one it was. So species B used to be just at it's currently right at the lowest elevations, but an example of how a species could respond, and we've got examples of these, where besides staying at that lower elevation, it's also moving upward to the suitable conditions. So these are kind of the opposite reactions here. So the first species, the range is retracting. So it's still present, but it's reducing the area it can occupy. And the species B is an example of one where it's actually able to expand. Not everybody's acting the same way, reacting the same way, responding the same way to these changing conditions. That's what makes it complicated. The one that's most concerning, or one of the most concerning, is the species here, species C, that is those examples of those mountaintop birds that are restricted to the mountain peaks, and that when the temperature changes and the vegetation community changes and everything changes, they're not going to have their habitat anymore and not going to be able to stay there. So those are one of the ones that you often hear about, or that case in terms of the effects. And then we've got a couple other examples. Let's see. D is an example of one that just moves up. So it used to be, and it just doesn't expand its range, it doesn't retract its range, it just moves from the lower elevations up a little bit. Species E, let's see what happens to species E. Species E just stays there at the same elevations. It basically is adapting to the new conditions. It doesn't expand or retract. And then species F, pretty much the same. No, species F, I got confused. Species F is kind of like species D in that it moves upward, but there's less habitat for it. So my point here is that not everybody is changing the same way. So if we start thinking about ecological communities, it's not as simple of, I think I met some people on the way in here that were talking about like pollinator gardens, and it would be really, do I just pick the whole pollinator gardens and from south of here and plant here in expectation of the climate change? Well, it kind of gets a little complicated fast when you start realizing that all these species are not going to change the same way. That was my point. The Bicknell thrush. How many people have heard of the Bicknell thrush before? Okay, so a good number of you. That is our species, that species C, example of in northeastern North America. They're restricted to these high elevation spruce fir forests. And so, again, not super common, not super abundant, but that's their unique habitat. And then as a result of these, the changes in temperature, global climate change, we're seeing their numbers disappear. And in fact, there's been a lot of concern and a lot of study, and I'm not an expert on this, but their populations overall, when you're looking at the whole range, roughly declining 4% each year. It varies from place to place what's actually happening. In the Catskills south of here, they've lost 70% of their population over 14 years, a 14-year time span. So that's one of the numbers I was able to find. In Massachusetts, they used to be more widespread. Now they're very limited where they are. In fact, right over the border in Mount Greylock, they had been consistently breeding there from the 1880s onward, and I can't remember, 1972 or something like that was the last time they were found to breed there. They're also getting hit on where they overwinter as well in terms of habitat loss. So this is a particular species that they've been tracking. Some populations in some areas are pretty steady in terms of occupancy, but there's a lot of research on this particular species. Now these are birds, so we're concerned about birds not being able to move to new habitats. Think about what if you're a little salamander. Your legs got to run quite a bit, and if you're in a place like that where you're isolated and you have no way to move, you can see how it can get very complicated, and especially if you move up thinking about ecological communities. Now I'm getting to my phenology, the title of the talk. So what do I mean by phenology? So that's where the study of the timing of life cycle events in plants and animals. So in terms of plants, and especially here where we've got a seasonality, you can think of when there's things that I didn't think about 10 years ago that I think about a lot now because I've been doing a lot of this research and these studies, but I didn't think about it that much before. But the timing of what day of the year that the buds burst in red maples or your sugar maples or whatever the plants are. So bud burst, that's when, once you start studying these things, it's amazing how much things you can measure. In my particular study, we kind of simplified things a little bit, but the phenologists they measure everything. So bud burst is an example when the leaves unfold and the leaves extend, flower bud burst, flowering, and you can look at the phenology in terms of the timing of when it initiates in a given year, also when it stops. So when there's no more buds bursting and the leaves have extended. And then also the length of time that it's in that phase. That's what phenologists study. So flowers, leafing, and think about an animal's reproduction, timing of reproduction, mating season, hibernation, migration. Think about when birds are coming back from down south, first red-winged blackbird. And this is an example that shows, and think about nesting too. I'm participating in an insect decline study that the dates of the sampling, we're sampling all across North America using standardized protocols. And in order to try to standardize across a large continental area with different elevations and different weather conditions, they tied it to, I'm not a lead on this study, they tied it to the tree swallows. So tree swallows are insectivores, they rely on insects for their food, and so they timed it to when in a given year that the birds would be making their nests, when they would be sitting on eggs, and then when they would have nestlings in the nest, and when the nestlings would be fledged. So we have that standardized, so that's kind of why I put that picture in there as well. And then this shows, has anybody here heard of the U.S. National Phenology Network? Awesome. We got a couple folks, but mostly not. They're, that makes sense. But they have been since 2007, I believe, is when they started their standardized data collection, looking at exactly this. Many of the studies that I'm going to be talking about. In fact, did I lose some slides? Because I thought I had some other stuff. Maybe when we transferred it into the Mac, it's all right. We'll be fine. I thought I had some other things I talked about. It's okay. Early spring activity. So some of the studies that I thought I had here in my talk looked at what has happened over long periods of time. So you look at museum collections, and you look at flowering plants, and you look at a lot of these data because you want to look at historic data. And this particular study, they said that very forward thinking. They're like, hey, we're seeing these changes, climate change, we want to be able to track things like individual species changes and think about ecological communities. And so we're going to set up this standardized long-term database where people can add to the data and use that. So this has been going on since 2007. So it's an incredible resource. They're able to use that information to predict timing of spring and tell you whether or not it's an earlier than usual spring or a later than usual spring, etc. So, okay, here's part of my slides. I was like, I think I changed the order on them or something like that. Okay, so phenology, that timing. This is an example of a study looking at changes in timing of flowering over long periods of time. And so where do they go? They go to a museum, and they go to herbariums. Herbariums, the museums and these collections that were collected so long ago for other purposes and documenting things are incredibly important resources for us to be able to study climate change, looking back in time. So here this is an example of a study from the Southern Rocky Mountains where they looked at herbarium specimens from the 1800s to present. And so they were trying to document rare species in the Southern Rocky Mountains, and they were looking at the date of first flowering for these this group of species. So they looked through a lot of specimens, and what they found was over this time that the date of first flowering on average was 3.1 days per decade earlier. So this is a steady change over time. And generally associated with warmer temperatures in the spring and winter. They also, again, finding out differences in the patterns as well, they also found that it varied a little bit. I mean, not all the species were the same, and it varied a little bit habitat by habitat as well. Not everything was changing the same. It gets complicated. But in general, they were able to document that, looking through those valuable, very valuable museum specimens. Now thinking about ecological communities and all these species living in the same area at the same time, and what happens when not everybody is following the same trigger in terms of, are we all changing the same? If it's going to get warmer, are we all going to arrive 2 days earlier? Are we going to or are some of us going to arrive 2 days earlier? Other ones are not going to track temperature, and they're going to track photo period, and they're not going to change at all. Like, this is where we're starting to think about, look at some of the concerns, start teasing apart what's happening by looking at phenological mismatches. So that timing. And you can easily wrap your head around it when you think about pollinators and the flowers that they're pollinating. They have this really tight, important relationship. When the insects emerge, are they going to be there? Is their food going to be there? And are they going to be able to pollinate these species? So there's a lot of studies, some of the historic studies on the insects, or the most recent studies looking at phenology, and the effects are looking at things like bees and pollinators and things like that. But we can also think about novel communities. If not everybody is moving at the same time in relation to temperature conditions, etc., Now you're going to have some species still where they were before, some species are going to be moving, some species, I don't know, they're going to expand their range, things are going to be changing. So the types of species that you're going to find in these communities are going to be different from historically. And it's important to realize that the Earth is not changing, is not steady. Climate's not steady, our natural systems are not steady. They're always kind of changing. But the fact that over time, you've got these species that sometimes a disease might come in, knock down a particular given species, but then they're able to come back. And the overall system is not being disrupted. But when you start getting like these novel communities and changes that are accelerated rates and not natural, we've got different concerns going on. So some of the studies, this is an example. I'm not going to go too depth into this because it really, I present this paper to my students and it's a tough one to wrap their head around. But what this particular study was looking at is they actually did experimental work where they wanted to see that if a species stayed at the same place during climate conditions, what would happen? If a species tracked and moved to under new conditions to a new area, how would it do with novel communities, and as opposed to if it stayed? And in general, what they found was, one key point that they found is that those species, again, this is a manipulative study, if those species that were moving to a new area to track temperature or whatever, and even though that they had different other species they were interacting with, they did better than the ones that stayed back. So I thought that was a really interesting finding of the study. Again, it's not the end of scientific research. You get part of a story, you add to it, and then you move on and you build on it. So I'm not sure how universal that will be, but interesting way to think about it. So now I just want to talk about ecosystems. Ecosystems, they are made up of the living and non-living community. So all the members, and this is a very interesting picture, but it still had everything that I wanted in it, even though it's a strange ecosystem, if you ask me. Yeah, the kangaroos hanging out by the pond, very interesting. But anyways, it still has the components in there. So an ecosystem, thinking about all these interconnections with these species that are living at the same time, at the same place, are made up of the living environment. So you've got your predators, you've got your trees, you've got your plankton, you've got any living organism that's in that area, living in that area, interacting in the same place at the same time. It also is made up of the abiotic or non-living. So you've got your sun, again, sun's energy, very important for photosynthesis, which drives energy flow through systems. You've got water, and again, this is not showing the whole situation, but thinking about the hydrologic cycle as water moves from one area across the landscape to another area across the landscape. How long is it going to stay there? Is it going to flood? Is it going to move through quickly? All that, again, is important in terms of that. How much dissolved oxygen and nutrients is in there? All that's part of the non-living environment. Rocks, things like that. So all these are interacting, and the living community is helping energy flow from organism to non-organism to moving through the system, through their different cycles. Nutrients, again, thinking about that, how they move through that. All that is in these ecosystems. These ecosystems are like natural systems in that they're not static. They have this dynamic equilibrium, this dynamic status where they're changing the community, the environmental conditions, you've got diseases coming in, lots of things happening. But overall, because they're all there and they've been, over time, have been sustained over other changing environmental conditions, all these members are important in terms of maintaining stability and sustainability over time, despite the fact that our environment's always changing. That's my point there. So, and this just shows a community, a food web of another community, who eats whom, and how energy food flows from one species to another species. And this, again, not the best diagram either, but what I liked is it shows the different connections between the species. Some species are going to be very tightly connected and related to another, so predator and the prey that it eats. Some species might not be directly affected through a food chain, but the fact that so it might be a weaker or an indirect relationship, but they're still occupying the same place at the same time, and they're still interacting with different portions of the environment. So think of this in terms of what an ecosystem is. And you get the idea of how difficult it is to, how do you study something like that? How do you, think about climate change in that? So I like to, when I teach my ecosystem ecology class, I try to start off talking about ecosystems and all these intricate relationships, and then talk about how scientists, you need to understand and appreciate the complexity. You have to keep that in the back of your mind as you approach the questions you ask and how you ask them. But then you step back and you're like, well, okay, what can I look at that's distinctive, that can help build evidence? So you don't do it all. But you keep that in the back of your mind, and then you look at it simplified so that you can, answer some questions. So I'm going to talk about the Vernal Pool Phenology Project, which I'm a co-lead on, because this is one where we're looking at, again, this is early in the data phase collection, but we're looking at the whole ecosystem. And I'm going to explain how we took that look and what we're looking at with this question, why it's relevant, etc. So this is part of the Ecological Researchers Education Network. So that's a network of ecological researchers at primarily undergraduate institutions across North America and beyond. And so it's a collaborative network, and to think about people that are at teaching at primarily undergraduate institutions, we're often the only ecologists there. We are often looking at you don't have a lot of funding, right? Not a lot of support from that, yet we're still expected to and want to publish research and expose our students and have them better understand the research process. And so oftentimes we'll look at local questions and work with community partners, which is great. But this network is awesome because it's a way that we can all understand and appreciate the constraints of doing research at an primarily undergraduate institution, and then also be able to take questions that we might have and then be able to broaden and ask questions at more of a continental or a regional or continental scale. So what we do in this network is we use standardized sampling. We try to adjust the questions and how we approach them. Oftentimes, so it coincides with the school year, so we can get students in the lab and the classroom to go out there, or through the summer research. And again, we have an excellent record in terms of high quality publishable data that we've involved undergraduates in part of the data collection and often in the analysis as well. And so this is a group of folks that I'm leading the Vernal Pool Project with. And again, it's a very inclusive, supportive community, and we welcome anybody. And I'll talk about how our particular study involves more than just undergraduates and researchers at undergraduate universities. So this particular project, all the four main folks were all amphibian, reptile, so herpetology type folks that are interested in that, experts in that, vernal pools, but we also had some other folks from the network that were plant ecologists, for example. So they brought in a different perspective in terms of helping us design the particular study and how we would ask this question. What we were looking at, what we wanted to do, and look at a more broad regional scale, is how do local and regional factors affect the spring phenology of amphibians and trees at these vernal pools, these really important wetlands, which I'll tell you about. And these are our two key players, wood frogs and spotted salamanders. If you haven't seen them before, they are very charismatic, and they are our poster children for this vernal pool phenology project. One of the things, if you get a research project going, is you hopefully have somebody that's artistic on the team. And Jen is artistic. She designed her own logo. I'm not, so thank you. I've got stickers. I should have brought some. I couldn't find them. I was going to bring them. And so this is an example of what a vernal pool typically looks like in the northeastern or eastern U.S. Situated very tightly in the eastern deciduous type forest community. There are vernal pools out in California that are more meadow-like. The systems are very different there. Here in the Northeast, they're situated primarily within a forest matrix. And so these wood frogs and spotted salamanders play a really important role in that. So we're looking at, we're thinking of this as a discrete system. So how do you take something complex, like looking at ecosystems, and try to bring it into something that you can study that's tangible? So these are typically small pools. You can kind of draw an edge on a pool. Kind of, it's hard. Everything's connected. So why do we pick it? There's, again, small temporary forested pools. They're very important habitat for key, they're unique communities, several key species like the wood frogs and spotted salamanders. They can breed in other situations, but they do best. In many areas, they do best in these vernal pools. They're often unprotected, and going back to that in the state, I guess, and we'll see how that goes. And this shows egg masses of the wood frogs on the left, and spotted salamanders, and this is an example of a vernal pool of tadpoles, wood frog tadpoles. That is how dense and how productive these vernal pools can be. That's pretty amazing. They're not always that dense, but that is amazing. So I'm going to try to, and one of the reasons why they're so unique and they have these species that are doing so well in these vernal pools is because of hydro period. So I forgot to mention that these pools, although they hold water in the spring, when the wood frogs and spotted salamanders are breeding, their eggs are developing, larvae are developing, but then they dry midsummer, end of summer, every year or every couple of years. And so as a result of that, they lack fish. Fish are huge predators. And really major predators on these species. These species are wiggling around trying to get food to get enough, large enough so that they're able to metamorphose before the pool dries up. And so fish and some of the other invertebrate predators that are more associated with permanent waters are lacking or reduced numbers in this situation. So they do, that's one of the reasons why they're so productive and they do so well. And they're of a conservation concern because in many states and many areas, they lack legal protection or they don't have very great legal protection. They also are often unrecognized and people don't appreciate the importance of these vernal pool systems. So they're definitely of a conservation concern, although wood frogs and spotted salamanders generally are throughout the range. They're doing fine, we're not about to lose them, but their numbers are dropping off in certain areas. Especially when these pools are destroyed, or the surrounding habitat. They're really important also because think of the wood frogs and spotted salamanders and all these species going to these vernal pools to breed, to forage, etc. And then when they leave, they head out into the forest. So they're bringing really important energy and nutrients from the vernal pools, transporting them to the surrounding forest. So they're really part of a broader ecosystem. That's why I can't really draw that edge at the edge of the vernal pool, the edge of the ecosystem. It's all really connected. So climate change is a concern because we've got, the pools have to hold water long enough for the wood frogs and spotted salamanders to make it out, etc. And with climate change, warming temperatures, etc., there can be changes as a result of that. So we're concerned, there's a concern about that. So some of these vernal pools may become, so those are wood frogs. Yes, I guess I accidentally hit the button, I don't know. But I'm glad that you guys were able to hear that. And if you saw the little ripples in the water, when you've got a bunch of their explosive breeders, they're, the wood frogs in particular, like right when after the snow melt and the water's there, they're like the first ones to the pool, and they have these massive breeding sessions. So the breeding can happen in one day, or sometimes in some years it'll be extended. But that's the little frogs there setting up their little territories, and then they have the little mass breeding event. So I wanted to, and they sound like ducks quacking in the woods. That's what I call them. All right. So what are we picking up of why these species and how it's all related, ecosystems, etc. So amphibian breeding, wood frogs and spotted salamander. One, they're early spring breeders. Oh my God, I teach at an undergraduate university. I need to incorporate undergraduates into my research. Okay, so early spring works. They're widely distributed. That means that they're not rare. That means that other faculty and other people can help participate. We want to look at data across a large geographic area. And they're common too. It's, these are of the other mole salamanders, the wood frog species that are tied to their eggs are very visible, so you can see them very easily. They're very distinct, and they're pretty common. Plants. What plants and why are we looking at them? So the plants, we're looking at dominant trees surrounding the pools, that are in or surrounding the pools. And we're looking at, and we're defining dominant as like a 5-meter buffer around the edge, where whatever species, there's at least 5 replicates in there. So 5 red maples, 5 red oaks, or whatever. You had to have at least 5. That's what we're considering dominant. And thinking about how they influence the vernal pool systems and why those trees are really important. Well, one, think about when the wood frogs are starting to breed, and in the early days before the leaves out, you've got an open canopy. You've got, at least in the northeastern U.S., you've got the deciduous trees that haven't leafed out yet, so you've got a lot of sunlight reaching the pool. So you might have a little bit more importance in terms of algae and the energy coming into the pool. But then once the leaves bud burst in the leaves, then you got more shading. So then you've got your cooling temperature, and that might be affecting the pool temperature as well. Oh, but then the trees, when they start to bud out, they're going to be extracting more water resources. So these are the kinds of connections that we're thinking about in terms of what pools are affecting, what trees and surrounding living organisms, so the trees surrounding the pools, what could be interacting most strongly with the pools. And it's interesting, when I mentioned the algae being more important in the beginning, in the food sources or energy sources in the beginning of the season, I had a colleague that actually used isotopes to analyze, and she found exactly that in the early days before the early times, the early parts of the season, it's going to be, the algae is going to be really important, the light, the photosynthesis, but then later it changes. So and leaf litter too is really important. So pools, they have the vegetation, the trees, the vegetation overhanging pools provide some shading, but also in our climate, we've got the leaves that fall in the fall, and that's adding important nutrients to the system. So a detrital-based food web in the pools for most of the year. So that's important. And I'll just say that the cycling of the wetting and the drying phase helps accentuate and speed up the nutrient processing too. So there's a lot of things, these are hot spots in a forest in terms of nutrient cycling and then moving it out to the others. This you kind of saw before, the temperature increasing over time, but also that's related to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So that's nothing new. This is another study that looked at climate change and phenology and also looked at, historic records. So again, looking at herbariums, etc. And this study, I think it was published in 2012, looked at plants flowering over the last 100, 150 years, looking at, again, herbarium and historic records. And they found that indeed plants were flowering from days to almost a month earlier than 100 or 150 years old. So it definitely varied by species. Everybody wasn't doing the same thing, but in general, you can see the trend line that it's becoming earlier. So this is how our hypothesis we set up. So that's what we were seeing in relationship, and based on the research. What has happened to phenology, trees, flowers, etc. over time, and then with how about the salamanders, so the amphibians that are breeding at these pools? Well, there's not a whole heck of a lot of records of that, like date of first egg mass deposition for many of these species. But there have been researchers that have used similar species, looked at similar species at certain locations, like the tiger salamander at the top and the marbled salamander at the bottom, and where they've had surrounded individual pools, breeding areas, and they put these fences and buckets around them, and it definitely takes a heck of a lot of time and effort, and something that I would not be able to pull off with my teaching load. But they surround these pools, and they would be able to, over decades, they would be documenting when the salamanders would first arrive at the pools, when they would leave, and numbers, and they get those kinds of data. And so what they found over those studies, those select studies that looked at these things long term, is that indeed, yes, spring migrating salamanders tended to be earlier. They're seeing that trend. And then the fall breeding salamanders, such as the marbled salamanders, were migrating later. So again, a couple of different studies. So we're showing that both animals, our target, or similar to our target species, are changing in terms of climate, and so is the plants. And so there's that potential for mismatches. Just think about that bee and the flowers, and if they're all, is everybody going to be changing in the same relationship to the changing environmental conditions, or are, one going to be changing differently? And from evidence that we've seen, everybody doesn't change all at the same time. So this is what we're trying to unravel in terms of ecosystems. So I'm not going to spend a whole heck of a lot of time what we did, but we did it cheaply, as much as we could. Undergraduate institutions. We did it with simplified methodologies so that we could train undergraduates, people could do it consistently, whether or not they're studying the same, experts in this area, etc. And we're identifying things like water level fluctuations pretty cheaply with a little water gauge. We're also using these hobo data loggers that will give us drying date of whether or not the pools. We're also measuring, thinking about ecosystem, canopy cover, so how much shade is making it to the pool. And then local air and water temperature, and then we have these really cool audio moth recorders that you can set to record, like we're doing it for like every 5 minutes every half hour, and we're able to document the first wood frog breeding or calling at a particular site. And we can do it without being there all the time. So I'm just looking at the time, because it looks like I'm just gonna, I know what I'm going to do. I'm not going to. So we're looking at data we're collecting is the first day of egg deposition for wood frogs and spotted salamanders. Again, very easy to see, visible through the water, and we're documenting only some of the things like bud burst, leaf unfolding, flower buds for the various species. And we're doing this across a large geographic area. And what are we looking for? Local versus regional variables. We're going to see which one is better aligned with phenology. But we're also going to look at those mismatches. So if the wood frogs start breeding 3 days earlier, will the tree buds also be budding out 3 days earlier or not? And we need a lot of people to collect a lot of data in order to be able to look at this over time. We're not going to be doing this three years or 30 years before we publish. We're going to be looking at these over 5 to 6 years, which we're about reaching right now in terms of that. So we're beginning to look at that data, and by the power of numbers and a broad geographic distribution, we're going to be able to reveal some things. Not sure what they are at this point. But that is what we're looking at, and the whole point of that is to talk about how we study ecosystems and looking at climate change and how they're affecting them. So hopefully that made a lot of sense. I want to also just mention the National Phenology Network. Because the National Phenology Network I mentioned before was established in 2007, and its goal was to have this standardized methodology where people all over the place were going to be collecting these data on phenology, and it would all be stored in this database. And so researchers would be able to study, and so far there's been an awesome, it's been going on from 2007, it's incredibly valuable. I've got a couple of studies that I'm working with some other folks on that. And there's a data collection app. The Pine Bush, as far as I know, does not have a phenology network trail, but all you need to do is take this little online training and you would be able to participate in this. We have a phenology trail at Siena. I had a student 2 summers ago, she was really awesome. We got done early with some of her work, so I'm like, hey, let's create this phenology trail. We picked out species, and our idea was, hey, this is a way that we're going to have a phenology trail on campus. We will be able to get undergraduates, build it into our curriculum so that they'll be able to experience this. We can tell them about climate change, get them a little bit to better understand how it's studied. And then incorporate it into our classes. It would make it easier for our students, even if we didn't have long-term data at our site, but students in my classes would be able to get this example, but then be able to use these large data sets from the Phenology Network. So it's awesome. We picked out the species. Savannah made a really awesome sign. We still have not collected any data for it, so this is one of the problems here. One is we need to get the sign up and get people to do that, which is fine. I'm actually not worried about that. The fact is that I just need to be able to get the right student and the right initiative to be able to do it, because it's something where the environmental club or something, so it's all ready to go. I even had another student that did an independent study where she actually has a presentation to help recruit people and the text for the script and everything. So we're really on the cusp of it. The new climate change, I gave a talk like this a couple weeks ago, and somebody suggested the fact that the new climate change curriculum that is just being required in New York State, this might be a really wonderful opportunity to help the education students work with us to get this up and running and build some curriculum on this. So I think this is like, one day we'll have this. I've already got the little pink flags out there. I've picked out the species and everything. So just wanted to tell you that's in the works. But that's about it. we're recruiting things for joining this vernal pool phenology project. So, should I just take questions?
Yes, just make sure you repeat the question.
Okay, use the microphone. Okay, I'll do my best. Yeah.
Our present understanding of climate change is really blinkered because we're only looking at carbon dioxide. We're only looking at the greenhouse effect. Early in your talk, you mentioned, and it's always repeated, but it doesn't penetrate, I think, among people. The Arctic is warming up extremely quickly. It's because ice is being lost. You've got all this dark water that is absorbing heat. Now, the next stage beyond what we call global warming is something I've published called global hyperwarming. When you melt continental ice sheets, you're going to have sea level rise. We all know that. It's going to be on the order of 300 feet, which puts this place where we're sitting about 130 feet underwater. Within perhaps, they estimate 500 years, but things are accelerating. So we might be beyond any hope of doing anything other than retreating. But what happens through geologic time when you have high sea levels? They're always talking about fracking. And fracking is organic rich shales that extend in the United States, halfway across the country, several times through geologic history. What's happening is you have extensive seas that cover continents that are absorbing heat, and this leads to an acceleration in global warming, and that also leads to basically dead seas that cover continents. You've got hot water, lots of algae, production of this organic rich mud that maybe in 1 million years survivors are going to crack. But that is the future within 1,000 years. So really, climate change has got to get beyond what was actually known in 1898. 1898, Arrhenius said, build up carbon dioxide or heats. But with the loss of ice, there is going to be an acceleration of these effects. We're not going to see it. Trump and Kim are not going to see it. But it is going to be the most disruptive thing that will have happened in the last 60 million years. And we're doing it.
Yeah, I don't speak loud yet, but I've probably considered my case at Packer Park for many years. Maybe outside town this year, March 16th, weeks earlier than normal, we had our first migration. It was really, the temperature was 6 degrees, Packer Park was much cooler here. On March 16th, the temperature stayed down kind of the year night, especially in my one not down 30 degrees. It was but it was an incredible experience because I've been doing it for many, many, many years. We're going to see crossing that early is amazing. You know, I have seen down there that kind of actually will move, but usually it's been end of month or like here, April 2nd, April 3rd, April 5th. So March 16th is pretty far apart. And our economy was already in advance, the mid-national over there.
Yeah, so I guess the comments talking about Thatcher in particular, right? Thatcher Park?
Yeah.
Yeah, about March 16th was the big migration date.
Actually, your big migration happened a week and a half later.
A week and a half later, okay. Yeah, all the dates blend into me, but blend in my mind. But I was going to mention that I have a couple of study sites. One of my personal study site that I work on is in Peebles Island. I have a pool there. But I also have a friend that is up on the Zim Smith Trail, has been monitoring a vernal pool there. And that historically, like, again, this is just over the last 5 years or 4 years or whatever, that's always been a couple weeks later, if not more. The wood frogs bred at both of those sites the same day was the date. So this particular year, it definitely was a lot earlier and more synchronous across the particular area from what I observed. And those are the kinds of things that we're going to try to look at. It's like, it's hard to say when you're in the moment, like, you know, you're like, okay, this is definitely an unprecedented year, and then next year ends up being a little different. I remember a few years ago, I think it was like in February, towards the end of February, it was getting really warm. Some of like the box elders were beginning to bud burst, because those are some of my trigger species that I look at on my way in. And I thought things were going to go before March 1st at People's Island, and then it like got cold or you know. So it's those kinds of patterns we're trying to get a little bit better information on, and hopefully we're able to at least look at it with a scale of the synchrony, like. Because, you know, sometimes the Thatcher would be way later, you know, than People's Island. And I think this year, I think they were all around the same time, which is very interesting. But how much does that vary from year to year? And so that's why we're trying to look at both air temperature, water temperature, and a lot of variables, both local. So we're kind of look at the pool regionally, but then also be able to zoom out and look over a larger scale. Go ahead. Go ahead. Or, oh yeah, okay, sorry. I'm not good at this.
Okay. You were mentioning about the polar bear and how they don't have as much ice, they have to swim a lot further to get to where they're going. Another thing that's happening is they're getting eaten by orcas. That's the other side of it. And the polar bears are apex predators. And they not only maintain the ecosystem, but they also monitor the health of the wildlife in the Arctic. So if you take out that apex predator, and you're not doing your job anymore, then you're talking about scavengers going in there, and the ecosystem and the health of the Arctic going down. So they're a major they're an implement that needs to be in the Arctic, and if the ice is gone and we eat by orcas, we're not going to get anything. Further bring down the system along with what you say about the ice and the water and everything else.
Roger, is that it?
Yeah, I want to follow up on the wood frogs. You know, the aforementioned wetlands law with the regulations have been nullified as of 10 days ago. I mean, the exciting part is that they were going to protect vernal pools for the first time. The problem we had was that it was predicated on productive vernal pools.
Yeah.
And the DEC defined it as, for the wood frog, it was 15 egg masses. So I'm kind of curious from your experience, you know, is 15 a large number, a small number? And then one thing that we were looking at, David, and seeing at Hudson, they found, we were looking at the vernal pools on their large land holdings up and down the Hudson Valley over a 10-year period, and they found that as frogs were emerging from brumation earlier and earlier, and I'm not sure I'm saying that right, is that sort of hybrid brumation, is that what it's called? Hibernation?
When they freeze like popsicles?
Well, this was a slow period.
Right, yeah.
They actually were coming out earlier and then dying in hard freezes. So they had wild variability from year to year. We're finding a lot of dead frogs. And so if DEC is defining what a valuable vernal pool is based on egg masses, do you see huge variability from year to year? They could miss it. And so I guess we have those concerns.
So 15 egg masses, it really varies on where you are. And I'm not sure, I don't really know the numbers that they had, but I think they had the numbers of egg masses varied depending on where you were in the state. And it was based on a study that they had did. So it was, so it was data driven. But I'd have to say that it really depends on the landscape you are in, what would constitute, like, I guess, again, it depends on how you look at productive, right? Like, is it productive in that it produces enough offspring to sustain that pool over time? Or is it more of a regulatory definition of productive in terms of we're not going to be able to protect all the pools, so in this landscape, this is where we would set the number in terms of productive, like that. Those are two different questions, and I suspect that it's probably a combination of the two. But very different in terms of numbers of egg masses depending on the landscape. So some places where you've got a lot of great connection between the pools, forested, you don't have a lot of roads and things, you can have, like I remember I was in northern Maine, they'd be breeding in these ponds, these ponds, oh my God, no, ditches, you know, like roadside ditches, like where a logging truck had gone through or something like that. Something that was definitely going to dry up before they had ever made it out, most likely. And well, not very, but there were just so many. It just, there was the breeding areas were so producing so many individuals that they were dispersed throughout the landscape. So they weren't always making it back to where they made it out of, and they were breeding in other areas. So it really depends on the landscape. And so in order to have like one egg mass number that would affect that would be equivalent across New York State, I would have to say you couldn't do it. It's just too different regionally. Yeah.
Okay.
So
It seems really inefficient to us, but like that's the rule. So.
Yeah, or it's not the rule anymore, but whatever. But in terms of dead frogs at sites, so they undergo this massive breeding event, and I often see dead wood frogs as a result of it. Usually it's females. So what happens is they do their little breeding thing, and they're doing their quacking and stuff, and then it's they jump on the female, and then sometimes there's multiple ones on them, and the females get really, and then they all try to, and then they tend to go to the egg masses tend to be deposited right next to each other. So in ideal conditions where they're going to get the most temperature, they're going to hatch out quick enough and survive and make it out of the pool before it dries up. So I often see dead wood frogs at a pool. I don't know how many of them I would see at a pool as after the breeding season. So that could have been some of it too.
So it may not be freezing, it could be other.
Yeah, it could be, especially wood frogs. They definitely get beat up if it's at the pool. But they also do fluctuate quite a bit from year to year at some sites in terms of the numbers of egg masses that I've seen.
Let's say the salamanders and the frogs, they have their house meeting day. All the eggs are fertilized, and then all of a sudden it gets very full because it's too early. What happens to the eggs? Are they viable? Do they die?
Oftentimes some of them die, and others that are in the right spot that might not have been a good spot if it, it might have been better to be on top if you were initially within that cold that ended up dying, and the ones below maybe survived it. So you get partial mortality as a result of it. One time I was up in Maine, we're walking along I went to school there, and we're walking along a trail, and we looked at the side at a vernal pool, and we looked, and it was like a lot of shrubs around there, and there's these egg masses hanging, dripping from the shrubs. And it just took a second to realize what happened is that when the branches were in the water, the frogs went and laid their eggs on there, but the branch was still in the ice, and when the ice melted, so yeah. And it took us all a minute to say, what? Oh. So I don't know, that's an interesting story. Anyways, I don't think it Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I don't know if there's any chance it goes up.
So, yeah, so if you've got, yeah, because some will be more hit than others, and there's a good chance. Yep. Was there? Go ahead.
I'm glad to finally have a name for myself. I didn't know I was a phenologist because I've been tracking.
I think I made that name up too. I don't know.
Thank you. I've been tracking this stuff in a book for years, and I do the DEC. Harper does the DEC. The Vivian Crossing.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah, and the wood frogs, the vernal pool is so frequently that I see. One of them is right along Route 295, where it's got to be full of road salt. And I just wonder about that. They're very active there. I don't know how they're surviving all that road salt and stuff from the winter.
I can't remember, is it 170 meters from the edge of the road? There's a certain distance that pools that are closer to the road have higher salinity in there, and there's been definitely studies that have shown that they have not done as well. Although a friend of mine up in Acadia found a breeding pool, like a tide pool, like right next to the shore, that definitely got tons of, and they seem to make it out, I'm pretty sure. It's weird. So I think that you might have, it's kind of like the things like with the coral reefs too. There's some coral reefs and there's some where they're actually able to adapt to the changing temperatures. It's just not met. So I think you've got some individual genetic variation within certain pools, and if there's enough variability in there, at least some of them might be able to adjust. And the problems, and I think Ed pointed out, everybody's pointed out, is it's just such a rapid change. It makes it so it's not as easy as it, I don't know if easy as it was, but it's more difficult to allow those natural changes and evolutionary changes to be able to come into play because of the rapid changing. But yes, there are definitely salt impacts, and it doesn't mean they can't make it out, but it might reduce the numbers and things like that.
In the ditch, right next to
Yeah.
Thank you.
The wood frogs actually have the ability to build up amine trees inside their body. It's made out of like a glucose material. And they can survive weather as cold as like the Arctic weather. And so they're very unique in that. Not a lot of animals do that. And the other thing is, at one time, the wood frog was actually proposed to be they had a proposition out to make the wood frog the national amphibian of New York State.
That would have been awesome.
So we'll take like maybe another 2 questions. Jean, you want to?
I wonder if you could take into account the USDA zonation
Hardiness zones?
hardiness zones. I do a lot of gardening, and I've seen over, I think it's got to be 5 or 6 years, we're zone 5, with no question about it. Suddenly we're zone 6B, and I find this kind of crazy because those guidelines are based on the lowest temperature at which a plant will still be able to survive. Well, this year we had, right here, we had a zone 4 winter. It was really cold, and I'm seeing in the garden that I lost a couple of things that were really supposed to be zone 5. Now they're saying zone 6B, which I think was based upon the hot summers that we were having. But I think that's really confusing to gardeners for sure, and confusing people. And I wonder how much you take that into consideration in your book.
So I don't take the zones, I don't look at the zones, but I have noticed that they changed. I was like, I didn't know they changed, but it does make sense, right? But the extremes are part of the disruption with the climate change, like the extremes, like the hottest hot summer, the coldest cold, like it's more unpredictable. I guess maybe somebody could predict it, whereas it was less, the variability is much greater and it's much more erratic, the changes. Like up in the Adirondack, Adirondacks, I brought my winter ecology class up there, and they trap small mammals under the snowpack in these little bucket runways that they have. I brought my winter ecology up there a class a few years ago, and there was like, we walked along where we would have been trapping if there was snow. I mean, this is in the Adirondacks in February, and it had, like, you could see the buckets, and they're sitting there, and there's hardly any snow on the ground. Luckily for their winter ecology, mammalogy class, they had snow the next week, and then they had enough snow. So, but those extremes are becoming more common, I think. That's,
Terry?
Yeah, another local example that everyone can notice, the tulip festival in Albany used to always be coinciding with the blooming of the tulips. The tulips were already blooming a month early. So I was,
maybe they should move Mother's Day then, right?
Well, this has been absolutely wonderful. I didn't know about this area of study, and I think you've raised some really interesting issues about how different species change at different times, and it's so complicated. I mean,
But you peel it back, and it's like you go simply.
I know, but it's so complicated.
It is.
So will you stick around for a few minutes? If people have more questions, they can come up and ask Mary Beth. Thank you all so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed this. And if anybody can stand and help us put tables back, we would appreciate it very much. I can tell you what. So thank you very much.